Hello and welcome to the final chapter of On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. Let's get started. The purpose of this chapter is to lay out a few examples so we better understand the nuances within Mill's theory. And there are two overarching points that he wants to make. The first is that an individual is not accountable to society for their actions unless their actions affect others. And the second point is that the actions that do affect others can be responded to by society with either legal or social actions. Now we're going to focus on 8 nuances within the theory. Nuance number 1. Society doesn't have a right to judge you on every single kind of suffering that you might be causing others. Or in other words, some suffering is legitimate. Sometimes suffering is an essential part of how an institution functions, and other times it's the result of a failing institution and not exactly the individual's. For example, consider an overcrowded profession. This means it's more likely when you accept a job that you're taking away the job from someone else, or you're limiting an opportunity for someone else. That doesn't mean you should be chastised for that person's suffering. Nuance number 2. Mill is not supporting interference with the free market or open trade. Mill says the act of trade is a social act, and those who seek to trade seek to affect society in a general way, and therefore trade should fall under social jurisdiction. And additionally, government interference with the market that has proven to be harmful is obviously bad and should be stopped, whereas government interference that is known to produce good effects, it's a little more difficult to deny. Nuance number 3. How far can the police interfere to prevent a crime? Case number 1. Preventing people from doing crimes or harm that they don't realize they're gonna do. So it is okay if we physically prevent someone from crossing a bridge that they don't know is broken. Or enforcing a law that requires poisonous materials to be labeled as such so people don't accidentally kill themselves or people around them. Because the point of liberty is to allow people to do what they want to do, and falling to their death wasn't what that man wanted to do. Case number 2. Why don't we just ban the poisonous substance altogether? Mill says we cannot do this because this penalizes the people who are using the materials legitimately, not punish an entire population for the wrongdoings of a few. Case number 3. Where is it okay to limit everyone, even the innocent users? Cases where this applies follows under a term called pre-appointed evidence. This means that in regards to products that are more likely to be used in crime, government can require those selling the objects to take down the names and other personal information of those that they are selling it to. As a result, in the case that those materials are used for crime, police are better able to track them down, and additionally there is a deterrent for those who want to use them for crimes. And this would be a legitimate violation of liberty. And finally, case number 4. Can the government interfere with crimes against oneself? The answer? Not really. Although certain crimes against oneself do increase the likelihood of crimes against others. Mill focuses on the likelihood of committing violence as a result of drunkenness, and also the likelihood of not fulfilling financial obligations if you fall under the category of idleness. And additionally, something worth noting is that sometimes context creates a crime. For example, being naked at home is fine, but being naked at the mall is not fine. Nuance number 4. People instigating or advising others to do things that are harmful to themselves. Additionally, the person who is looking to harm themselves is making that choice themselves, and they should be free to consult others about the best method of whatever they want to do. But in the case that somebody is advising another to hurt themselves, we have the additional complication that usually they have something to gain in that scenario. Fornication, for example, must be tolerated, and so must gambling, but should a person be free to be a pimp or to keep a gambling house? While Mill says he can't really even begin to dissect and solve the moral dilemma, punishing the accessory to a crime, but not the act itself. And even less can be said in regards to enforcing a similar rule on things that are bought and sold. In other words, can we punish the seller of a known evil? In other words, can we punish cigarette companies? However, this becomes difficult to prove and create laws against because truly, any consumer good could be used in excess. Nuance number 5. Can the state indirectly discourage the individual from committing behavior we know to be harmful to the individual? Or in other words, can we put a tax on cigarettes and another tax on cigarettes and another tax on cigarettes? Why does the state care if you want to cigarette yourself to death? Oh no, they'll never play this video in schools now. Their choice of pleasures and their mode of expending their income after satisfying their legal and moral obligations to the state and to individuals are their own concern and must rest with their own judgment. However, taxation is inevitable, and taxation will always appear as a penalty for purchasing a good. If the government has to choose between putting extra tax on cigarettes or putting tax on a good that needs to be accessible to members of all classes, then it's not so bad if the tax goes on the ciggies. In regards to crimes that might occur as a result of selling substances like alcohol, it does make sense for the government to require licenses for selling, and therefore they can control the type of person dishing out substances that make people break into cars. Nuance number 6. Contracts that people enter into and then violate once their ideas of self-interest change. First, people are not beholden to contracts that require them to harm third parties or themselves. And this is why people are not allowed to sell themselves into slavery. The principle of freedom cannot require that he should be free not to be free. It is not freedom to be allowed to alienate his freedom. The slavery example is on the extreme side of the spectrum. However, the result is that there are no contracts in which you have zero possibility to get out of. And this especially applies to contracts that affect third parties. If you sign a contract that has you dumping metals in a river, but you discover that river is poisoning the people down the stream, you don't have to do it. The exception might be contracts that are strictly dealing with money. Nuance number 7. In no cases does the ideas of self-interest or individual liberty apply to a situation in which one person is taking over the commanding role of the self-interest of another person, or sort of enveloping that person into their individual liberty. And this is most prevalent in regards to familial relations. The almost despotic power of husbands over wives needs not be enlarged upon here, because nothing more is needed for the complete removal of evil than that wives should have the same rights and should receive the protection of the law in the same manner as all other persons. And this also applies to people's jurisdiction over their own children. People do not get to treat their children in any way that they want and justify that under the guise of individual liberty. And this does tend to happen wrongly because people view their children as an extension of themselves, and men view their wives as extensions of themselves. And Mill goes further to talk about the obligations that people should have as a result of their choice to bring a child into the world. For example, he says people should be required to ensure that child becomes educated because it has such a monumentous effect on their life. And to be clear, he says this should be a legal obligation. And additionally, choosing to bring a child into the world in a situation where they cannot possibly survive, and even further where their existence might threaten the lives of others, for example, if there is not enough food to go around, then that is not only a crime against that child, it is a crime against the people around you. The laws which, in many countries on the continent, forbid marriage unless the parties can show that they have the means of supporting a family, do not exceed the legitimate powers of the state. And our final nuance number 8. What about objections to government interference where liberty is not our concern? And there are 3 cases for us to focus on. The first is that there should not be government interference in things that could be better done by individuals. The second case is where it's not necessarily done better by individuals, but it is important that individuals do it as it provides them a mental education. You might also see individuals fulfilling that service in a way that is more experimental and diverse, whereas the government institutions will likely all be the same, and therefore the diversity of individuals, institutions, is better in the long term for the country. And similar to earlier in the book, this means individuals can likely find better ways of doing things in the future, even if in the short term they're worse at doing it than the government. Additionally, there has to be some space left in which individuals can be concerned with the general public. Otherwise, we're left with a society in which people are only thinking about themselves or their direct family members. And finally, point 3, there is something to be said of the great evil that is adding any unnecessary power to the government. With any additional responsibilities that the government takes over, the public, in time, loses their ability to take on those responsibilities themselves. And with a continuation of this over time, we will find ourselves eventually in a society that cannot sustain itself on its own, or even push back against the government should a time come that we would need to do that. Okay, that's everything for On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys for our next book, which will be The Art of War.